Tom Slater's here. Tom, very good morning to you. I'm sorry about the background. I mean, it's not very Christmassy. It's the best we can do, apparently. This is about as imaginative as the head of graphics gets.
Well, you know, nevertheless, at least it's wintry, if not that Christmas.
Wintry, yes. You know. Maybe that's the problem. You know, there's no reference to Christmas at all.
No, not.
You know, it's like you might as well be on the BBC. Anyway, very good morning to you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Let's talk about this ECHR ruling, first of all, in the Telegraph. Some bloke from Turkey who has been one of the top sort of heroin kingpins of this country for many a year, sent to prison. He's 70 years old, and I think his name is Alevi Kurd, and he's won the right to remain in the country on the basis that it would breach his human rights to a family life, even though he's had an extramarital affair with a woman in Turkey. Brilliant.
Incredible. And it's not even the first time we've seen a story like this, is it, Mike? I mean, the procession of things we've seen recently, Albanian crime lords, terrorists, being able to stay in the country because of their right to a family life. And yet often, as you see in this case with this gentleman, this right to a family life hasn't stopped him from having multiple affairs. Also, his apparent terror about going back to Turkey because, as an Alevi Kurd, he might be subject to some kind of discrimination. Hasn't stopped him going back to Turkey multiple times. I believe he's even got a Turkish passport.
On holiday.
This is absolutely ridiculous.
It's just taking the mickey, isn't it?
First and foremost, the criminals know it's a joke, which is why they're exploiting it. And yet people still talk about this system as if it is totally rational.
And it's safeguarding people whose lives might be in danger. I mean, it would be one thing if you were saying, look, this guy's a refugee, you know, he's a political asylum seeker because he was critical of the government and they don't like that, and if you go back, you're going to get locked up for being a dissident and all of that. This is not about that. This is about a drug dealer, a dangerous drug dealer, who is dangerous, even by the standards that the legal authorities in this country have. He is a danger to the public in Britain because he's a gangster, effectively. Right? That's what he is. Pure and simple.
And it's ridiculous that this is being kind of prioritised over the safety of the law-abiding majority. But this is a story that we've heard time and time again. You would just hope that next year the penny starts to drop with some more politicians. That just because something is called the European Court of Human Rights, just because something is called a human right on paper, doesn't mean it really is in reality. It's just become a loophole.
And who are these immigration judges? Because, I mean, we've been asking this question for quite some time now, whether judges should be held more accountable for what they do. Immigration judges backed his claim, rejected an appeal by the Home Office against him remaining in the UK. They ruled that it would breach his right to a family life based on Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and that there was a risk of persecution over his Kurdish birthright. So, according to immigration judges, if you're Kurdish and you come to Britain, you should be allowed to immediately be offered you know, free housing, and you should be allowed to stay here, because otherwise you might get persecuted in your homeland. I don't give a stuff, frankly. Even if you're not a drug dealer and you happen to be Kurdish and you happen to live in Turkey, that's your problem. Why do we have to deal with it?
Also, it reminds us, doesn't it, that if the system is supposed to be working properly, it is that there are going to be a number of people who, because of the fact that they do face genuine persecution or they were genuine political prisoners, that's the system that people think that they're supporting. Not people pretending to be discriminated against in their native country, so they can continue to stay here and, you know, exist off the largesse of their heroin empire.
And break the law and run a heroin empire. But also, I would even go further. I would say, why are we, single-handedly, supposedly in Western Europe, the saviours of all these people who come from these dodgy countries where people get persecuted because they've got different beliefs to the government? I don't really care. I'm sorry if they're going to wipe out, you know, half the Kurdish population in Turkey. It's not my problem. Doesn't mean they can all come and live in Camden, does it?
Well, I think it's one of those questions where you poll people, you ask people, you know, do you think there should be a kind of proportion of people that we take each year on the basis of need, on the basis of genuine kind of
but I don't see why we should. I'm sorry. I mean, I draw the line before that. I just say, why? But then, why should we?
Would you extend that to Ukrainians? Would you extend that to... There's all sorts of... There's always going to be a proportion that I think people are willing to take, but that comes under certain conditions. Numbers is one for many people. I think the other one is recognising that the system can't just be easily gained. And it is being easily gained.
Well, the Ukraine situation, right, you can easily single that one out, because for the large part, most of the people who came here from Ukraine did not come here with a view to settling in Britain. Some of them may have decided to do that. Some of them may have met people and decided to get married here and all of that, fine. But generally speaking, the Ukrainian project was about saving people who were actually in imminent danger from getting blown up by the Russians. And so we said, look, come and live in Britain, we'll look after you, and then when it's safe to go back, you can go back. Same with the Syrians. You know, the Syrians were supposedly going to go back, and some of them may well do, now that they've got rid of Bashar al-Assad. That's all fine. But I don't see why we should be the sort of the keep net for anyone who thinks that they can come and live in a country where they're not going to be persecuted, because in their own country they would be. I don't see why we should do it.
I think the big problem is, how do you sort out the kind of rightful claims from the unrightful claims? And that, because the biggest problem right now is it's quite clearly just being used as I say, as a loophole for criminals and wrong-uns, or just as a route for migration, which is not what it was.
No, I mean, surely you work out who's right and who's wrong and who's deserving and who's not deserving by having a blanket ban on it, and then saying you only get in if you make a special application and prove that you've actually been put in some kind of immediate danger, but by something which is temporary, from which you can then go back once it's gone. Because if you come from a country where there's a horrible government and they want to kill you, well, you know, I'm sure that's really awful for you, but that's not our problem, is it?
Well, it's not the question of it's not our problem. I suppose it's a question of should nations, that when they're in a position to do so, and when there's democratic support for doing so as well, which I think is very important, should they, you know, take a proportion. But the difference is, especially with our current system, is it's really kind of failing the people who would most be at need. Like, for instance, because we're in a situation where if you manage to get enough money together to pay a people smuggler and you can survive the trip over the channel, then somehow that puts you in a much better position than if you're women and children in a camp somewhere who've just been pushed out of their home by jihadists or authoritarians or whatever. They're in a much better position just because they've been able to run the gauntlet and get onto the territory. That makes absolutely no sense, but it's something that we're stuck with.
So you get a reward for leaving your women and children behind, and we bring you in and welcome you and give you a free house, and we give you money for the rest of your life.
It just makes no sense,
it's wrong.
You know.
And I think most people listening to this will agree with me, because, you know, we're a soft touch and it's got to stop, because, you know, the fact is Britain is full. Britain's got too many people living here. All of the things that we can't do, like access the NHS, like drive down the street, like get on a train, all the things that we find difficult are the problem of overcrowding, to me, anyway.
Well, I suppose in terms of that issue, that's primarily one of the kind of legal migration picture as much as it is anything else.
Sure.
So there's a lot of discussions need to be had all the way down, but what's quite depressing at the moment is we haven't even really started to have that kind of discussion, because the Tory party were kind of trying to ignore a lot of these problems and dysfunctions because they presided over the system, and Labour obviously just don't really care about fixing any of those.
Well, Labour, I think, are quite actively encouraging it. That's the problem. And going back to countries where the things are not as they should be, front page of the Daily Mail this morning, fascinating story. This broke late yesterday afternoon. Tulip Siddiq, who's a controversial MP anyway, in, I think, the East End of London. She's the City Minister, responsible for stamping out corruption in Britain's financial sector, is being investigated by the Bangladeshi government because her family is all about taking bribes of up to £4 billion. Incredible.
It's an incredible story. This is something which probably was coming, insofar as Tulip Siddiq has always been quite cagey about the fact that her aunt was Sheikh Hasina, who was recently sort of, you know, ousted from government in Bangladesh. She's obviously, therefore, always been very kind of tuned in and tied in to the establishment over there, and therefore that raises questions about what sort of thing she was involved in. And in this case, kind of an alleged corruption probe to someone who's charged with looking into corruption in the city. You couldn't really make it up.
You really couldn't.
I'm surprised that there wasn't more foresight as to whether or not something like this, whether or not questions like this would have been raised, given her family connections, which have been known about for a very long time, obviously.
Absolutely right. According to the Mail, the country's Anti-Corruption Commission launched the probe into Ms Siddiq, her UK-based mother Sheikh Rehana Siddiq, and her aunt Sheikh Hasina Wazid, the ousted former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who ruled the country with an iron fist for more than 15 years. Hasina fled Bangladesh to India in August, with Rahina at her side after weeks of violent protests in which security forces killed hundreds of civilians. And the investigation was launched after an order from the country's High Court, which heard claims that Tulip Siddiq may have helped to broker a nuclear deal worth £10 billion with the Russians. I mean, these are people who are in government in Britain, right? What's going on?
No, it's incredible. And it's also such an incredibly bad look. You would think that the government wouldn't have just allowed themselves to be exposed like this, because questions like this would have been raised. Again, we don't know guilt. This is something which is being investigated in Bangladesh. This is not something that's going through our own particular processes. But at the same time, they would have known that something like this could come up, particularly in the context of her aunt being ousted.
Isn't this another case where Keir Starmer should have been a bit more careful about his selection of cabinet ministers, like Louise Haigh, who it turned out was a convicted fraudster, but he made her Secretary of State for Transport. There's a picture here from 2013 of Tulip Siddiq with her aunt and Vladimir Putin signing a deal for $1 billion arms scenario and a nuclear power plant project. And there she is, standing literally in the same frame as Vladimir Putin. Now, call me old-fashioned, but if I was Keir Starmer, I would go, do you know what? When I'm appointing members of the Cabinet, I'm going to check and see whether they've got any pictures of them standing with Vladimir Putin. And if they have, maybe we shouldn't give them the job.
Just
not difficult,
idea.
is it?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Is it? I mean, you know, the bar doesn't have to be that high.
Not at all. And even if you're just doing it at a kind of unprincipled PR level, it's probably not a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, people you shouldn't be photographed with if you want to be in the government. I think it's a pretty easy rule of thumb, isn't it?
You would think so.
Goodness gracious me. Let's get a voice note from Matt with some festive cheer.
It's beginning to fall apart for Starmer. Everywhere you stroll, take a look in at number 10. It's chaos once again, as they're sucked in through their imaginary black hole. It's beginning to fall apart for Starmer. The toolmaker's son knew such a bore. And the most likely thing you'll see is the policeman that will be at your own front door.
That's brilliant. What a way to start the show. I mean, I've been incredibly impressed by your creativity. We had some lovely stuff over the course of the last few days, and that, I think, tops it all. Matt, with some festive cheer. We may have to play that throughout the show at the top of every hour. Tom Slater's here from Spikes Online.